man who invented democracy had never seen a sunset in his life. And this is not a metaphor. He had been born in a cave, or so the story goes, because his mother had gone into labor while fleeing from something, a war, a rival, a debt. And by the time she stopped running, the child was already pushing into the light. The cave still exists, somewhere on the mountainous spine of Attica, though no one can agree which one. Every village in the region claims to have the real cave, and they all sell little clay replicas to tourists who nod solemnly and pretend they know who Cleisthenes was. But the truth is more uncomfortable than the cave. The man credited with birthing the world's first democracy was an aristocrat who owned slaves, who manipulated the voting system so thoroughly that his own reforms made him all but untouchable, and who, at the end of his life, was exiled by the very people he claimed to have freed. When I first read about Cleisthenes in a university textbook, the page was illustrated with a photograph of the Athenian assembly, Pnyx, they called it, a natural bowl of rock carved into a hill, where thousands of citizens gathered to vote on war, on taxes, on exile. The image showed a clear blue sky, white stone, and a single man standing at the speaker's platform, his arm raised in a gesture of argument. It was beautiful. It was also a lie. Not the place itself, but what the textbook allowed you to believe about it. Because what that photograph could not show was that among those thousands of citizens, not a single woman stood, not a single slave, not a single person born outside Athens, not even the merchants whose ships made Athens wealthy. The men in that photograph were, by the most generous estimates, perhaps 15% of the adult population living in Attica. And they were voting on the lives of the other 85%. The word democracy, demokratia, means rule by the people. The problem is that the ancient Greeks had a very narrow definition of who counted as a person. A male Athenian citizen, born of Athenian parents over the age of 20, who had completed military training and who owned property, or at least had the means to maintain himself without labor, that was a person. Everyone else was a body. A woman was a body that produced heirs. A slave was a body that produced labor. A foreigner was a body that produced taxes. And the beautiful irony of Athenian democracy is that the more enthusiastically it embraced the principle of equality among its voting citizens, the more brutally it enforced the hierarchy beneath them. The system was not hypocritical. It was structurally dependent on exclusion. The leisure to vote required someone else to plant the wheat. The time to debate required someone else to haul the water. The freedom to think required someone else to remain silent. Consider the very first time the word demokratia appears in any surviving Greek text. It is in a work by the historian Herodotus, and he is describing a debate among Persian nobles about what form of government Persia should adopt. One of the speakers argues for democracy, and Herodotus puts into his mouth a speech about equality before the law, about the abolition of tyranny, about the supremacy of the common good. It is a stirring defense of popular rule, but the speaker loses the debate, and Persia remains a monarchy. And then Herodotus, with the quiet irony that runs through his entire histories, notes that the Persians who argued for democracy were the same men who owned entire villages of slaves. There is no record that Herodotus saw the contradiction. Or perhaps he saw it perfectly and expected his readers to see it too. We cannot know. Some historians argue that he was simply reporting what the Persians said, not endorsing it. Others believe he was deliberately exposing the hypocrisy of all political systems, including the one he lived under. The truth is that we only have fragmentary accounts, and the exact reason is lost. But let us walk into Athens on an ordinary voting day. Let us feel the heat of the sun on the limestone steps of the Pnyx, the dust rising from the dry earth, the murmur of hundreds of voices debating a single question. Should we send more ships to Sicily? The vote has been called by the council, which has already deliberated for a week behind closed doors. An orator named Nicias rises to speak against the expedition. He is a wealthy man, a general, and he speaks slowly, dripping with caution. He warns that Sicily is too far, too powerful, too dangerous. He reminds the assembly of their recent losses, of the plague that killed 1/3 of their population, of the cost in bronze and timber that such a campaign would require. The crowd is restless. Some of them begin to jeer. Then another man rises, Alcibiades, young, handsome, burning with ambition. He speaks of glory, of the natural, right of Athens to rule the sea, of the wealth that Sicily will pour into their hands. He mocks Nicias as a coward. He calls on the old glory of Marathon, of Salamis, of the great victories of their fathers. And the assembly, swayed by his voice, votes for war. Thousands of men raised their hands that day, and within 2 years, most of them would be dead in the Sicilian quarries, starved, diseased, worked to death by their captors. I honestly cannot decide if this is brave or foolish, the willingness of a crowd to vote itself into destruction. On one hand, it was their choice. No king commanded them to fight. No foreign power forced them. They debated, they listened, they decided. On the other hand, the system that allowed them to decide was engineered for precisely this kind of catastrophe. Because the same democracy that gave them the vote also gave them the orator. And the orator, then as now, was a professional. He had trained his voice in the gymnasium. He had studied rhetoric under the sophists. He knew exactly which words would trigger the crowd's fear, its greed, its pride. The voting citizen, by contrast, was a farmer or a craftsman who had spent the morning arguing with his neighbor about a broken plow. He was not prepared for the polished cadence of a man who had spent his entire life learning to deceive. To me, the most unsettling part is not the manipulation itself, but the way the Athenians built their entire political system around a problem they could never solve: the tension between equality and expertise. They believed that every citizen, simply by being a citizen, had the wisdom to judge matters of war and peace. But they also knew that some men were better at persuading than others. Their solution was to rotate leadership randomly, to use the lot for most public offices, and to ostracize anyone who seemed to be gaining too much power. Ostracism, from the word ostraken, meaning a piece of pottery, was the act of voting a man into exile for 10 years, purely because the people were tired of his face. No crime was required, no trial, just a shard of broken clay, scratched with a name, dropped into an urn, and the man with the most shards was escorted to the gate and told not to come back for a decade. The first ostracism we know of was directed at a man named Hipparchus, a relative of the tyrant family that Cleisthenes had overthrown. But the practice quickly became a tool for settling grudges. A man accused of no crime could be exiled simply because his neighbor disliked him. Another could be banished because his political rivals organized their clients to vote against him. The system was supposed to prevent tyranny, but it often functioned as a legalized form of mob violence. And the Athenians, who prided themselves on their civilization, their philosophy, their art, their theater, these same Athenians would gather in the agora on a bright morning and cheer as one of their own citizens was led away from his home, from his family, from everything he knew, because someone had scratched his name on a piece of old pottery. The raw physicality of this is what sticks with me. The pottery shards themselves. I have seen them in museums, in glass cases under soft light, and they are so ordinary that they could be mistaken for trash. A broken handle from a wine cup, the rim of a storage jar, the base of a drinking vessel. Someone took this piece of garbage, turned it over, and wrote the name of a man they wanted to destroy. And then they dropped it into an urn, and that piece of garbage became the instrument of exile. There is something profoundly honest about the crudeness of it. No paperwork, no seals, no elaborate procedures, just a shard, a name, and the will of the crowd. And the crowd was always right, because the crowd had spoken, and the crowd was the demos, and the demos was sovereign. And sovereignty could not be questioned without committing impiety. The democracy of Athens was a machine of high ideals and low instincts, and the two were inseparable. The same assembly that voted to build the Parthenon also voted to execute the philosopher Socrates. The same citizens who wept at the tragedies of Aeschylus also cheered the massacre of the Melians, a small island that had refused to join their empire. So the Athenians killed all the men and sold the women and children into slavery. The Melian dialogue, recorded by Thucydides, is the most honest document of Athenian imperialism we have. The Athenian generals did not pretend to be just. They told the Melians that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And the Melians, who had placed their hope in the gods and in the justice of their cause, were slaughtered. Their children were sold. Their land was given to Athenian settlers, and the democracy that had voted for this massacre went home and celebrated a festival in honor of the God of mercy. But perhaps the greatest lie we tell about ancient Greek democracy is that it was a seed that would eventually flower into our own. This is the story we tell ourselves to feel connected to the past, that the Athenians invented the vote, and then the Romans improved it, and then the Enlightenment perfected it. And now we are the inheritors of a 2,000-year tradition of freedom. It is a comforting narrative. It is also almost entirely false, because the Athenian democracy did not evolve into anything. It did not spread. It did not inspire. It was crushed by the Macedonians, then by the Romans, and then it disappeared for 2,000 years, until a handful of 18th century European intellectuals rediscovered it and cherry-picked the parts they liked, while ignoring the slavery, the misogyny, and the mob violence. Our modern democracy is not the great-grandchild of Athens. It is a completely different creature, wearing a costume borrowed from the dead. So when I stand on the Phoenix today, and I have stood there in the shadow of the Acropolis, looking out over the modern city of Athens, I feel something complicated. The place is quiet now, just a rocky hillside with a few excavated stones and a plaque in Greek and English. Tourists take selfies. A man sells bottles of water from a cooler. Children chase pigeons across the ancient stones. And I imagine the voices that once filled that space, the thousands of men shouting, laughing, weeping, voting, condemning. And I imagine the bodies that could not speak, the women watching from the rooftops, the slaves listening from the doorways, the foreigners counting the days until they could leave. They were the majority. They were the ones who made democracy possible. And they are the ones history forgets. The last vote of the Athenian democracy was cast in 322 BCE, when the Macedonian general Antipater abolished the constitution and installed a property requirement so high that only the richest 9,000 men could vote. The democracy did not die in a blaze of glory. It died quietly in a meeting room with a few men arguing over clauses they could no longer enforce. And as the scribe wrote down the final word of the final decree, sealing the end of the world's first experiment in popular rule, a different kind of light was rising far to the north, not in Athens, but in the mountains of Macedonia, where a boy named Alexander was learning to ride a horse that no one else could tame, and the world was about to change shape entirely. The boy who would be called great was not yet 16 when he tamed the horse that no one else could ride. The story is famous. The horse, Bucephalus, was brought to Philip of Macedon with a price tag so high that the king laughed and turned away. But Alexander saw that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned the animal's head toward the sun, so the shadow fell behind instead of in front, and mounted calmly. The horse ran, and Alexander held on, and when they returned, Philip wept with pride and said, "My son, find yourself a kingdom worthy of you. Macedonia is too small for you. You have heard this story 100 times. It is the founding myth of every biography of Alexander. It appears in Plutarch, who wrote 4 centuries after the fact, drawing on sources that were already legendary. But here is what the story really teaches us, if we look at it coldly. Alexander's first great act was not a military victory, not a diplomatic triumph, but the subjugation of an animal through psychological manipulation. He saw a fear, exploited it, and turned terror into obedience. And the historians who recorded this moment presented it as proof of his genius. To me, this is the most unsettling part of the entire Alexander legend, that we celebrate a teenager for mastering the art of dominance, and we call it greatness. The lie we tell about Alexander the Great is that he was a civilizer, a unifier, a man who wanted to bring Greek culture to the barbarian world and create a brotherhood of mankind. This lie has been repeated in every generation, from the Roman emperors who imitated him to the British imperialists who compared themselves to him, to the Hollywood films that show him as a handsome, noble visionary. But the truth is that Alexander was a conqueror in the most literal sense. He took things that did not belong to him, destroyed anything that resisted, and left behind a trail of burned cities, mass graves, and enslaved populations so vast that the slave markets of the eastern Mediterranean were glutted for a generation. The massacre of Thebes is a necessary starting point. Shortly after Alexander became king, the city of Thebes rebelled against Macedonian rule. Alexander marched south with his army and, in a single day, destroyed the city that had once been the most powerful in Greece. 6,000 Thebans died in the assault. 30,000 were captured and sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground, so completely that when the Roman traveler Pausanias visited centuries later, he found only a few scattered stones and a population living in huts among the ruins. And this was not a hot-headed mistake. Alexander made a deliberate example of Thebes. He wanted every other Greek city to see what happened to those who defied him. It worked. No major Greek city rebelled again while he lived. The light that fell on Thebes that day was the same light that falls on any battlefield, indifferent, impartial, incapable of judgment. But the men who walked in that light made choices that would be judged for millennia. 6,000 bodies, and then 30,000 bodies chained together, and then the smoke rising over a city that had stood for centuries. And Alexander, still a teenager, watched it all from his horse, and then turned north to plan his next move. The light did not change. It never does. But the problem with celebrating Alexander for this is that we are celebrating a man who sold 30,000 human beings into slavery because they had the audacity to want their freedom. And we call the people who did this Greeks, and the people who resisted barbarians, even though the Thebans were as Greek as Alexander himself. The word barbarian meant, originally, someone who did not speak Greek, whose language sounded like barbar to Greek ears. But Alexander turned it into a moral category. A barbarian was anyone who opposed his will. Nowhere is this clearer than in the campaign against Persia. The official story, the one Alexander himself promoted, was that he was avenging the Persian invasion of Greece 150 years earlier. He was leading a pan-Hellenic crusade to free the Greek cities of Asia Minor, to repay the burning of Athens, to fulfill the destiny of Hellenic civilization. This was propaganda, and it worked brilliantly. But the reality was simpler. Alexander needed money. He had inherited a bankrupt kingdom and an army that was unpaid. The Persian Empire was the largest repository of wealth in the known world. Conquering it was not a mission of liberation. It was the biggest heist in history. Consider the siege of Tyre. Tyre was an island city off the coast of modern Lebanon, heavily fortified and defended by a navy that controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander could not take it by sea, so he built a causeway, a mole of stone and earth stretching half a mile across the water, using rubble from the abandoned mainland city. The siege lasted 7 months. The light on that causeway changed shape every day. At dawn, a pale gray line across the blue at noon, a white scar of broken limestone at dusk, a dark bridge of shadow. Men died on that causeway every day, killed by arrows, by stones, by fire ships that the Tyrians sent to burn the siege towers. But the causeway grew inch by inch, stone by stone, body by body. When the causeway finally reached the walls and the Macedonians broke through, the slaughter was methodical. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the assault. 2,000 were crucified on the beach, their bodies left to rot as a warning to other coastal cities. The remaining 30,000 inhabitants were sold into slavery. The causeway still exists. It turned Tyre from an island into a peninsula, a permanent scar on the geography of the Levant. When I first read this account, I was struck by the sheer engineering ambition. But then I think about the men who were crucified on that beach. They were not soldiers in any modern sense. They were merchants, fishermen, priests, fathers, sons. They were nailed to wooden posts and left to die in the sun, and their bodies were left there for weeks, maybe months, until the birds had picked their bones clean. And Alexander, this man we call great, walked among them perhaps, on his way to inspect the fleet, and did not order them taken down. The terror was the point. The terror was the message. But the greatest lie about Alexander is not that he was a civilizer, but that he was a unifier. He married a Persian princess, Roxane, and encouraged his officers to take Persian wives. He adopted Persian court customs, including the practice of proskenses, the act of bowing or prostrating oneself before the king, which the Greeks considered sacrilegious because it was an honor reserved for the gods. He mixed Macedonian and Persian troops into joint units. He founded dozens of cities named Alexandria across his empire, planting Greek settlers alongside native populations. On the surface, this looks like a fusion of cultures, a vision of a cosmopolitan world. But look closer. Alexander's fusion was entirely one-sided. He demanded that Persians adopt Greek military techniques, Greek administrative structures, Greek language for official business. He never learned a single Persian language himself. His courtiers had to translate for him. He appointed Persians to subordinate positions, but the top commands remained Macedonian and Greek. The cities he founded were Greek islands in a non-Greek sea, designed to spread Hellenic culture, not to absorb local traditions. And the proskencies he demanded was not a gesture of equality. It was a demand for absolute submission, enforced by the threat of execution for those who refused. When the historian Callisthenes, a man who had written flattering accounts of Alexander's campaigns, refused to bow, Alexander had him tortured and killed. This was the price of unity, total obedience or death. I honestly cannot decide if this is the act of a visionary or a tyrant. The historical record is fragmentary, and many of the sources were written by men who had every reason to flatter Alexander or to slander him. The truth of what Alexander actually intended is lost behind the propaganda of his own lifetime and the myth-making of the centuries that followed. Some historians argue that he genuinely believed in a fusion of peoples, that his marriage to Roxane was more than political, that he wanted to create a new ruling class that combined the best of Greek and Persian traditions. Others argue that it was all pragmatism, that he needed Persian administrators to run his empire, because there simply were not enough Greeks to fill the posts, and that the marriages were a cynical tool of control. I have no definitive answer for why this happened, only guesses. But the weight of the evidence suggests that Alexander's unity was always a hierarchy, with Greeks at the top and everyone else beneath. To me, the most revealing moment of Alexander's career comes after the conquest of Persia, when he was at the height of his power. He had burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian kings, in a drunken revel. He had defeated Darius III and watched him die, stabbed by his own courtiers. He had taken possession of the greatest treasure the world had ever seen, 5,000 tons of gold and silver, according to some estimates. And then, in the palace of Susa, he organized a mass wedding. Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself took 2 more wives, and there was a great feast with music, dancing, and wine. It was supposed to symbolize the union of East and West, but immediately after the wedding, Alexander left. He did not stay to govern. He did not stay to administer his new empire. He left to conquer India because the known world was not enough. He had no interest in building anything. He was interested only in the next victory, the next river, the next battle, the next pile of treasure. He was an addict, and his addiction was conquest. The empire he built had no infrastructure, no succession plan, no administrative system that could survive his absence. As soon as he died of a fever or poison or drink, no one knows. His generals carved up the empire between them and began fighting each other for scraps. The unity he had supposedly forged lasted exactly as long as his own heartbeat. Consider the march through the Gedrosian desert near the end of his life. Alexander led his army through 400 miles of barren sand and rock in the heat of summer because the monsoon winds had made the coastal route impassable. He had been warned, the local guides told him, that no army had ever crossed that desert and survived. He went anyway. Thousands of soldiers died of thirst, of heat stroke, of exhaustion. Women and children who followed the camp died in even greater numbers. The wounded were left behind. The sick were abandoned. The army left a trail of bones stretching across the desert like a road marker. When Alexander finally emerged on the other side, with less than half his men, he celebrated with games and sacrifices. There is no record that he apologized, or mourned, or acknowledged that he had led his own soldiers to a preventable death. This is the man we call great. The physical evidence of Alexander's passage is still visible in the way the ruins crumble. I have visited the site of Alexandria in Egypt, the most famous of his cities, and what remains is not a fusion of cultures, but a ghost of Greek ambition. The library has burned. The lighthouse has fallen. The city that was once the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean is now a teeming modern metropolis where the ancient stones are used as foundations for apartment buildings, and where the only trace of Alexander is a handful of coins in a museum, stamped with his profile. His hair the same wild shape as the mane of Bucephalus. The last light on those coins is worn smooth by centuries of handling, thumbed by merchants and soldiers and slaves who passed the coins from hand to hand without ever knowing whose face they held. And as that light faded over the harbor of Alexandria, a different kind of light was rising to the west, not in Macedonia, not in Persia, but in a small Italian city on 7 hills, where a republic was learning to fight its neighbors, and the iron discipline of legions was beginning to sound like a threat that no Greek could answer. And that republic, Rome, would one day claim to be the true heir of Greece. But which Greece would it inherit? Not the Greece of enslaved Thebans and crucified Tyrians, certainly, but a Greece of marble philosophers and pure geometry, a Greece that had never existed. The lie that Rome perfected, and that we still believe, is that the ancient Greeks were a people of reason, that they invented logic and science and philosophy in a clean, sunlit world, free from the murk of superstition. The truth is that the Greeks were among the most superstitious people who ever lived, and their greatest thinkers spent as much time consulting oracles and sacrificing goats as they did writing dialogues. The rational Greece we think we know is a Renaissance painting, not a historical reality. The oracle at Delphi was the most powerful institution in the Greek world for over 1,000 years. People came from every city, every kingdom, every corner of the Mediterranean to ask the god Apollo a question, channeled through a woman called the Pythia, who sat on a tripod over a chasm in the earth and breathed in vapors that made her speak in riddles. Kings consulted her before declaring war. Colonies were founded on her advice. Laws were written or abandoned based on her mutterings. The Athenians, the same people who gave us democracy and philosophy, paid the oracle enormous sums to tell them whether to build a wall, whether to attack a neighbor, whether to plant olives or wheat. They believed that the gods spoke through her, and they organized their entire civilization around the answers. What did those answers actually sound like? the surviving records are frustratingly vague. The Pythia often gave ambiguous replies that could be interpreted in multiple ways. A built-in insurance policy for the priests who ran the sanctuary. When Croesus, the king of Lydia, asked whether he should attack Persia, the oracle said that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. He crossed, and he destroyed his own. The priests explained that the prophecy had been accurate. He just had not asked the right question. When the Athenians asked how to defend themselves against the Persian invasion, the oracle told them to trust in their wooden walls. The generals argued about whether this meant the wooden walls of the Acropolis or the wooden hulls of their ships. It was the ships that saved them at Salamis, and the oracle was celebrated as wise. But what if they had chosen the Acropolis? The oracle would have been forgotten, and the priests would have found another temple to manage. To me, the most unsettling part of the Delphic oracle is not the ambiguity. That is typical of all oracles, everywhere, in every culture. It is that the Greeks, who prided themselves on their cleverness, their skepticism, their ability to argue any side of a question, accepted this institution without serious challenge for 1,000 years. There were critics, of course. The philosopher Xenophanes complained that the gods were human inventions. The playwright Euripides put words into the mouths of characters who doubted the oracles. But these were exceptions. The vast majority of Greeks, including the most educated, believed that the gods spoke through the Pythia. Socrates himself, the father of Western philosophy, claimed to be guided by a personal divine sign, a daemonian that spoke to him in moments of crisis. He listened to a voice in his head that he believed came from the gods. We call him rational, but he would have been perfectly at home in a room full of fortune tellers. The light that fell on Delphi was the same light that fell on the Athenian assembly, bright, clear, Mediterranean. But it illuminated something very different. The sanctuary sits on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a natural amphitheater of gray stone and olive trees, where the air is thin and the wind carries the smell of wild thyme. I have stood there, in the ruins of the Temple of Apollo, where the Pythia once delivered her prophecies. The guides will tell you that the famous vapors were probably ethylene gas seeping from a fault line in the rock, and that the Pythia's trance was a physical effect, not a divine one. But the Greeks did not know that. They only knew that something strange happened in that place, and they built a civilization around respecting the strangeness. The lying continues into our understanding of Greek science. We are taught that the Greeks invented the scientific method, that they were the first to explain the world through natural causes rather than divine intervention. This is true of a few thinkers, but it is not true of Greek culture as a whole. The same Thales who predicted a solar eclipse also believed that magnets had souls. The same Pythagoras who discovered mathematical ratios also believed that beans contained the souls of the dead and forbade his followers from eating them. The same Aristotle who wrote the foundational texts of biology, logic, and ethics also wrote seriously about the generation of animals from mud and believed that eels spontaneously emerged from the slime of riverbeds. He was wrong about almost as many things as he was right about, and he had no way of distinguishing between them because the method we call science, systematic experimentation, hypothesis testing, peer review, simply did not exist. I honestly cannot decide if this makes the Greeks less impressive or more impressive. On one hand, it is humbling to realize that the greatest minds of antiquity spent their time measuring the circumference of the earth and also debating whether goats breathe through their ears. On the other hand, the fact that they could make any progress at all, given the tools they had no telescopes, no microscopes, no reliable instruments of measurement, no tradition of controlled experiment, is remarkable. They were feeling their way in the dark, and they stumbled as often as they walked. But the real lie is not that the Greeks were sometimes irrational. The real lie is that we have selectively edited their irrationality out of the picture to create a usable past. The Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century, Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, needed ancient Greece as a model for a secular, rational civilization. They could not afford to have Socrates talking to a personal demon or Pythagoras banning beans. So they simply ignored those parts. They created a sanitized, marble-white version of Greek thought, stripped of its religious context, its magical beliefs, its messy contradictions. This sanitized Greece was then passed down to us through textbooks, museums, and popular imagination. The irrational parts were relegated to footnotes or to separate books on Greek religion that no one read. Consider the mystery cults. These were secret religious societies that promised their initiates special knowledge and a better afterlife. The most famous were the Eleusinian mysteries, held annually at a sanctuary outside Athens. The rituals were so secret that we have almost no reliable information about what happened inside. Initiates were forbidden, on pain of death, from revealing what they had seen. But we know that the mysteries involved a ritual reenactment of the story of Persephone, the goddess who was abducted to the underworld and returned each spring, a myth of death and rebirth. We know that initiates drank a special potion called kykeon, probably containing a psychoactive substance, possibly ergot, a natural source of LSD-like compounds. We know that the experience was powerful enough that many initiates reported that it changed their lives, removed their fear of death. And these mysteries were not a fringe cult. They were central to Athenian civic life. The most prominent statesmen, generals, and philosophers were initiates. Plato refers to the mysteries in several dialogues. The sanctuary at Eleusis was one of the most important religious sites in the Greek world, supported by public funds, protected by treaties. And yet, when we teach Greek philosophy, we almost never mention that the same men who debated the nature of the good also drank psychedelic potions in secret ceremonies to commune with the gods. We find this embarrassing, so we hide it. The light that entered the telesterion, the initiation hall at Eleusis, was a different kind of light from the Athenian sun. The hall was enormous, capable of holding thousands of people, but it had no windows. The only light came from torches, and the most important moments of the ritual were performed in total darkness. The priest would strike a gong, and a single flame would appear, illuminating the objects of the cult. A sheaf of wheat, a statue, a scene of Persephone's return. The effect was theatrical, carefully staged. But the Greeks did not see it as theater. They saw it as a direct encounter with the divine, a moment when the boundary between the human and the godly dissolved. I will step aside here and admit something. When I first learned about the Eleusinian mysteries, I was struck by how much we do not know. We have archaeological evidence of the site. We have literary references that hint at the rituals. We have chemical analysis suggesting what might have been in the Kykeon. But the core experience, what it actually felt like to be an initiate, what you saw, what you believed afterward, is lost forever. The initiates kept their promise. They died without telling. There is something beautiful and frustrating about that silence. The Greeks, who wrote so much, left a deliberate hole in their own record. But the most persistent lie about Greek culture is not about religion or science. It is about the Greek body. We imagine the ancient Greeks as physically perfect, muscular, athletic, nude in a way that was natural and unashamed. This image comes from the sculpture. The marble gods and athletes that fill our museums are the models of human perfection, broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted, symmetrical, eternally young. But these statues are not accurate representations of how Greeks looked. They were idealized, filtered through artistic conventions that smoothed away wrinkles, scars, fat, and age. Real Greeks were shorter than we imagine. The average man stood around 5'6", and they suffered from the same diseases, deformities, and dental problems as any pre-modern population. Their teeth were worn down by the grit in their flour. Their bones show evidence of chronic malnutrition, healed fractures, and the joint damage of hard labor. Nude body in Greek art was not a celebration of the natural body. It was a celebration of an ideal that no real person could achieve. And the Greeks themselves knew this. The sculptor Polykleitos wrote a treatise called the Canon, which set out the mathematical proportions for the perfect male figure. The head should be 1/7 of the total height, the foot should be 1/6, and so on. This canon was used to create statues that were more perfect than any living human. Real bodies fell short. The pleasure of viewing such a statue was not recognition, it was aspiration. And for the Greeks, the gap between the ideal and the real was a constant source of tension, a reminder that the world of flesh was always inferior to the world of forms. But the Romans, and later the Renaissance, and later the Enlightenment, took those statues and turned them into propaganda. They said, "Look at the Greeks. They were beautiful, rational, free. You should be like them." And we believed it because we wanted to believe that perfection was possible, that somewhere in the past, human beings had achieved what we cannot achieve now. We have been trying to live up to a marble lie for 2,000 years. The evening light on the statues in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens falls in long gold rectangles through the windows, catching the polished surface of a kuras, a young man carved in the 6th century BCE. His lips are slightly parted. His hair is curled in precise spirals. His body is smooth, unreal, frozen in a step he will never complete. And around him, in glass cases, are the broken things, the terracotta figurines with missing limbs, the votive offerings shaped like ears and eyes and genitals, the everyday pottery that held wine and oil, and the ashes of the dead. These were the real Greeks. They did not look like the kuras. They looked like the cracked pots, the chipped figurines, the worn-down teeth in the skulls that the archaeologists find beneath the foundations of the temples. And as the last light faded on that marble face, unchanged for 25 centuries, a different kind of light was rising far to the east, where a carpenter's son had been executed on a hill outside Jerusalem. And a new story about the meaning of human life was beginning to spread. A story that would absorb, transform, and eventually bury the world of the Greeks. That light from the east carried many things: a new god, a new story, and also the older stories that the Greeks had borrowed and renamed. The carpenter's son was not the only traveler on that road. With him came the silent shadow of Egypt, the measured stars of Babylon, the winged bulls of Nineveh, and the lie we tell ourselves, the lie that has shaped the last 500 years of history, is that Greek civilization was a miracle, a spontaneous birth of genius on the rocky soil of the Aegean, untainted by the older cultures that surrounded it. This is false. The word miracle is revealing. It was used by the art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann in the 18th century to describe Greek sculpture, and it caught on because it flattered the European imagination. A miracle requires no explanation. It is an act of God or of mysterious racial genius that cannot be analyzed or traced. And for centuries, Europeans wanted to believe that classical Greece was such a miracle, a pure, white fountain from which their own civilization had flowed, without any debt to the darker peoples of Africa and Asia. The truth is that the Greeks themselves knew better. They never claimed to have invented everything. Herodotus, the father of history, openly stated that the names of almost all the Greek gods came from Egypt. Plato wrote in the Timaeus of an Egyptian priest who told Solon, "You Greeks are always children. There is no old tradition among you." The priest was being condescending, but he was also being accurate. Greece was a latecomer, a borrower, a brilliant adapter of older civilizations. Consider the alphabet. The Greek alphabet, which gave us the words of Homer and the dialogues of Plato, was adapted from the Phoenician script, a writing system developed by a Semitic people who lived on the coast of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. The Greeks did not invent writing. They took the Phoenician letters, changed some of them to represent vowels, and made it their own. The word alphabet itself is a combination of the first two Phoenician letters, Aleph and Bet. Without the Phoenicians, there would be no Greek literature, no philosophy, no history, at least not in the form we know it. And yet, when we teach the history of writing, we start with the Greeks. The Phoenicians are a footnote. The light that falls on a papyrus scroll, I think, could tell a different story. The sun that dried the reeds, the hands that cut and pressed them, the ink made from soot and gum, these came from Egypt. The script that covered the page came from Phoenicia. The language was Greek, and the ideas, those traveled from even further east. The Greek philosopher Thales, whom we call the first scientist, predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BCE. He did this not by observing the stars himself. He had no instruments precise enough, but by studying Babylonian records of lunar and solar cycles, records that went back centuries. The Babylonians had been keeping astronomical diaries for over 1,000 years. Thales had access to that data, probably through the trade routes that connected the Greek cities of Ionia to the Persian Empire. He did not discover astronomy. He inherited it. The same is true of Greek medicine. Hippocrates is called the father of medicine, and his oath is still recited by doctors. But the Egyptians had been practicing medicine for millennia before Hippocrates, with detailed anatomical knowledge, surgical instruments, and treatments that modern research has shown to be effective. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, contains descriptions of brain injuries, spinal cord damage, and treatments that would not be improved upon for 2,000 years. Hippocrates almost certainly drew on Egyptian medical knowledge. The Greeks were not starting from nothing. They were building on foundations laid by others. So why do we insist on the Greek miracle? The answer is uncomfortable. In the 19th century, European scholars needed a genealogy for their own civilization that excluded the peoples of Africa and Asia. The ancient Greeks were white, or at least they could be imagined as white. The Egyptians were darker-skinned. The Phoenicians were Semites. The Babylonians were Asiatic. To create a pure European lineage, it was necessary to sever the Greeks from their Eastern and African roots, to pretend that Greek civilization was self-generated, and to portray Egypt and Mesopotamia as stagnant cultures that contributed nothing to the progress of humanity. This was racism dressed as scholarship, and it worked so well that we still believe it. I honestly cannot decide whether to be angry or sad about this. The evidence is not hidden. It is in plain sight in the texts and artifacts that fill museums. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Egyptians colonized Greece in ancient times and taught the Greeks the arts of civilization. The philosopher Pythagoras spent years in Egypt and Babylon, studying with priests and magi. The sculptor Phidias was influenced by Egyptian monumental statuary. The mathematics of Euclid has roots in Babylonian geometry. And yet, the story we tell ourselves is that the Greeks invented everything on their own, because the alternative, that Europe's founding culture was deeply indebted to Africa and Asia, has been too threatening to admit. The light that falls on the bust of a Greek philosopher in a museum is carefully aimed. It comes from above, from a skylight, making the marble glow. The bust is white, pure, isolated on its pedestal. But if you turn around, you might see another case in a darker corner, where the Egyptian and Assyrian artifacts sit, painted pottery, winged bulls, hieroglyphic inscriptions. The light does not reach them in the same way. They are darker, older, less familiar. The museum architecture itself tells the lie. The Greeks are at the center, illuminated. The others are peripheral, dim. Nowhere is this more visible than in the story of the so-called Orientalizing period of Greek art. In the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Greek pottery and sculpture underwent a sudden transformation. They began to feature lions, sphinxes, lotus flowers, and other motifs that had no native Greek tradition. These designs came from the Near East, brought by traders and craftsmen who settled in Greek cities. The Greeks did not hide this. They called the style Oriental Anatolikos, meaning from the East. But modern art history textbooks often describe this period as a revolution or an awakening of Greek genius, as if the influence had somehow passed through a filter and emerged purified. It had not. The Greeks were learning from their neighbors, and they knew it. To me, the most striking evidence of this debt is the Greek practice of monumental stone sculpture. Before the 7th century BCE, the Greeks made small figurines of clay and bronze. But around 650 BCE, they suddenly began carving life-sized human figures in marble, the kur and korai that we associate with archaic Greek art. The inspiration came directly from Egypt, where monumental stone sculpture had been produced for over 2,000 years. The Greek statues follow Egyptian conventions. The left foot forward, arms at the sides, fists clenched, the rigid frontal pose. The proportions are different. The Greeks slimmed the body, made it more naturalistic. But the starting point is unmistakably Egyptian. The Greeks took the Egyptian formula and made it their own. They did not invent it. The voice of the Egyptian priest in Plato's dialogue echoes down the centuries. You Greeks are always children. It is a harsh judgment, but it carries a truth. The Greeks were the children of older civilizations. They grew up fast, and they surpassed their teachers in many ways, in philosophy, in drama, in political thought. But they never denied their debt. It was later Europeans who denied it for them, who scrubbed away the Oriental influences, who painted the marble white, who invented a Greece that had never existed. The light that comes from the East, then, is not the light of a new beginning. It is the light of a very old sun, one that had already risen over the pyramids of Egypt and the ziggurats of Babylon before it reached the shores of Greece. And the Greeks, standing in that light, built something beautiful. But they built it from materials that others had shaped. I will pause here and admit that I do not have a definitive answer for why this erasure has been so successful. The racial theories of the 19th century are no longer academically respectable, but their influence lingers in the way we teach, the way we curate, the way we think about the past. Perhaps It is simply easier to imagine a genius like Aristotle as a solitary mind, floating free of context, than to trace the complex web of influences that actually produced his thought. Perhaps the idea of pure origins, a pure Greece, a pure Europe, a pure civilization, satisfies a need for belonging that the messy truth of cultural borrowing cannot satisfy. And yet, the evidence is there, in the broken pottery and the carved stone, in the words that Herodotus wrote and that we still read. The Greeks themselves were curious about their own origins. They traveled, they asked questions, they recorded what they learned. They did not pretend to have invented everything. That was a later invention by people who wanted to use the Greeks as a weapon against the rest of the world. As the light from the east began to fade, and the Roman Empire rose and fell, a new light was kindled in the west. Not the white marble light of a museum, but the warm, smoky light of a monk's lamp, bent over a manuscript in a cold scriptorium, copying the words of a Greek philosopher onto parchment, preserving what had survived the wreck of centuries, and deciding with each stroke of the pen what would be remembered and what would be lost. The monk's hand was cold. It was always cold in the scriptorium, even in summer, because the stone walls held the nights, chill until noon, and then released it slowly, reluctantly, as if the building itself preferred the cold. He dipped his quill in the ink, lampblack mixed with gum arabic, and a little wine to keep it from freezing. And the scratch of the nib on parchment was the only sound in the room, apart from the breathing of the other copyists and the occasional hiss of a candle wick drowning in molten tallow. His fingers were stained black at the tips. The color worked deep into the creases of his knuckles, and when he blew on them to restore some warmth, his breath condensed in a small cloud that hung in the lamplight before dissolving. He was copying a text he did not fully understand, a commentary on Aristotle's physics by John Philoponus, a 6th century Alexandrian scholar whose name meant lover of toil, and he had been working on this same page for 3 days. The words were difficult. The grammar was twisted, but the abbot had told him that this text was precious, that it contained truths that the world needed, and so he copied. He did not ask why the truths needed to be in this particular arrangement of letters, or who had decided that this commentary was worth preserving, while other scrolls were left to rot. He simply copied. The lie we believe about the survival of Greek civilization is that it was inevitable, that the great works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle were so obviously valuable that they were naturally preserved across the centuries. The truth is that almost everything was lost. Of the hundreds of tragedies written by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, only 32 survive, 7 each for Aeschylus and Sophocles, 18 for Euripides. The rest are fragments, quotations in later authors, scraps of papyrus recovered from Egyptian garbage dumps, a few lines preserved on a torn piece of parchment used to wrap a mummy. Of the works of Aristotle, only about a third survive, and most of those are lecture notes, not polished publications. Of the library at Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, nothing remains. The building burned, probably more than once, and the scrolls that were not burned were scattered or decayed. But before I speak of burning, let me talk about the small things, the sensory facts that history rarely records. The scrolls in the library of Alexandria were stored in pigeonholes, wooden cubbies lined with cedar oil to repel insects. When you pulled a scroll from its cubby, the cedar scent would cling to your fingers for hours, mixing with the smell of old papyrus and dust. The papyrus itself was rough, slightly warm from the climate, and it made a sound when you unrolled it, a delicate crackling, like dry leaves pressed together. The ink was carbon-based, black, and slightly raised on the surface, so that you could feel the letters as well as see them, as if the words had texture. The library was not quiet. It was full of the sounds of reading aloud. Greeks read aloud, even when they were alone, and the murmur of 100 voices, each speaking a different text, would have filled the great hall with a low, musical hum, like a beehive tuned to the frequency of human speech. And the light came from high windows, angled to catch the sun's path without letting direct rays damage the papyrus. So the room was filled with a soft, diffuse glow, with dust motes drifting through it. And when you looked up from a scroll, the world seemed to be made of golden air. This is what the Library of Alexandria felt like. I will never experience it. Neither will you. It is gone. And the loss of that sensory world, the smell of cedar and papyrus, the sound of 100 men reading aloud, the sight of dust, motes in a column of Mediterranean light. That loss is as real as the loss of the texts themselves. We mourn the books we cannot read. We should also mourn the room we cannot enter. The library was built by the successors of Alexander, the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt from the new city of Alexandria. They wanted to collect all the knowledge of the world, every book, every scroll, every text that could be acquired by purchase, by copying, or by theft. Ships entering the harbor were searched for books. Any found were confiscated, copied, and the copies returned to the owners, while the originals stayed in the library. This was not a gentle borrowing. It was literary piracy, state-sponsored. And it worked. At its height, the library held perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the collected wisdom of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and beyond. But a library is not a guarantee of survival. It is a concentration of fragility. The first destruction came by accident, when Julius Caesar set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, and the flames spread to the docks, and then to the library buildings. The extent of the damage is debated by historians. Some say a few scrolls were lost. Others say tens of thousands. We have no definitive answer because the accounts are fragmentary. Then there was the destruction under the Roman Emperor Aurelian, and then the destruction under the Christian Patriarch Theophilus, who ordered the destruction of the Serapeum, the daughter library, and the pagan temples that housed the scrolls. And finally, there was the slow decay of centuries. The scrolls that were not burned were eaten by insects, rotted by damp, or simply discarded when the language became unreadable. The Library of Alexandria did not die in a single catastrophe. It died 1,000 small deaths. To me, the most unsettling part of this story is not the burning, but the discarding. When the Roman Empire became Christian, the old Greek texts were pagan. They were not always destroyed by violence. Sometimes they were simply not copied. A monk in a scriptorium, given a choice between copying a pagan poem and copying a psalm, would choose the psalm. The poem would sit on a shelf until the parchment decayed and was scraped clean for reuse. This was called a palimpsest, a manuscript that had been written, scraped, and written over. The lower text, the original Greek, was visible only as a ghost, faint traces of ink that modern scholars can read with ultraviolet light. The ghost of Greek literature survives in those palimpsests, fragments of lost plays, lost poems, lost histories, preserved by accident beneath the words of a medieval prayer book. Imagine the hand of the monk who scraped the parchment clean. He would have used a pumice stone, rubbing the surface in a circular motion until the old ink was gone, the thin layer of skin removed from the animal's hide, the words erased. He would have felt the resistance of the fibers under his fingers, the slight give of the material, the way the parchment changed color where he had rubbed, a little lighter, a little thinner. He would have blown the dust away, tiny white particles of erased Greek, floating in the air of the scriptorium, settling on his robe, on the floor, on the pages of the prayer book he would soon begin. And he would not have known that he was erasing a poem by Sappho, or a lost play by Aeschylus, or a history by an author whose name no longer exists in any surviving text. To him, it was just old writing. To us, it is a door that will never open again. But the transmission of Greek philosophy is an even stranger story than the one of destruction. Because while Western Europe was scraping Greek words off parchment, another civilization was preserving them. In Baghdad, the caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty sponsored a massive translation project. Greek texts were translated into Syriac, then into Arabic, by scholars who were often Christians, Jews, and Muslims working side by side. The most famous of these translators, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, traveled through the Byzantine Empire collecting Greek manuscripts, comparing different copies to produce the most accurate version, and then translating them into Syriac and Arabic with a precision that amazed later scholars. He was paid, by one account, the weight of the books he translated in gold, a literal measure of how much the Abbasids valued Greek knowledge. The light that fell on the manuscripts in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was not the cold light of a European monastery. It was the warm, golden light of the Mesopotamian sun, filtered through latticed windows, falling on pages written in 3 scripts, Greek, Syriac, Arabic, each carrying the knowledge of a civilization into the hands of another. The scholars who worked in that library were not passive preservers. They were active interpreters. They commented on Aristotle, criticized him, expanded him, corrected him. The Greek tradition did not survive unchanged in the Islamic world. It was transformed. And when it returned to Europe, through Spain and Sicily, it returned in that transformed state, carrying the work of Avicenna and Averroes alongside the work of Aristotle and Plato. The irony is that many Europeans, when they first encountered these translations in the 12th and 13th centuries, did not know they were reading Arabic commentaries. They thought they were reading pure Greek philosophy. The names of the Islamic philosophers were Latinized. Avicenna became a name on a page, without his Arabic context, without his religion, without his culture. He was absorbed into the European tradition as an authority, a source, a voice in a chorus that was supposed to be purely Greek. And this erasure was so thorough that even today, many educated people do not know that the preservation of Greek philosophy was largely the work of Muslim scholars. The lie that Greek civilization survived on its own merit through the natural admiration of posterity is a story that erases the contributions of the very people who saved it. I honestly cannot decide whether to be angry or sad about this. The evidence is not hidden. It is in the texts themselves, in the chain of translators, in the Arabic marginalia that European scholars sometimes scraped off to make room for Latin notes, one erasure following another, one layer of forgetting piled on top of the last. We like to think of preservation as a pure act, a noble service to truth. But preservation is always selective. It always serves someone's interests. The texts that survive are the texts that someone, at some point, decided were worth keeping. And that decision was never neutral. Consider the works of Aristotle. Of the roughly 200 titles attributed to him in antiquity, only about 30 survive. The lost works include dialogues written in the style of Plato, polished, literary, intended for public circulation. We have fragments of these dialogues, preserved in quotations by later authors, and they suggest a more accessible, more literary Aristotle than the one we know from the dense lecture notes that survive. The philosopher we study is not the philosopher he wanted to be remembered by. He is the philosopher who happened to survive in the form that happened to survive through the accidents of history. I have no definitive answer for why some texts survived and others did not. Chance played a role, a fire here, a flood there, a monastery that was sacked, a library that was neglected. But patterns also emerge. Works that were useful for education survived. Works that could be reconciled with Christian theology survived. Works that were too long, too obscure, or too controversial were more likely to be lost. The canon of Greek literature that we have inherited is not a random sample. It is a biased sample, filtered through the priorities of the institutions that preserved it. Now I am sitting in a room of my own, writing by electric light, surrounded by books that are printed, bound, and mass-produced books that are not going to decay, or burn, or be scraped clean for reuse. The survival of Greek civilization is no longer fragile. It is printed in 10,000 libraries, stored on servers, accessible from a device that fits in a pocket. But the fragility has not disappeared. It has only shifted. The voices that are preserved now are the voices that we decide to preserve, the texts we choose to digitize, the authors we choose to teach. The same process of selection that shaped the Greek canon shapes our own. We are the monks now. We are the ones deciding what will be remembered and what will be lost. And as the light from my screen falls on the page I am writing, I think of Sappho's fragment 31, the famous Ode to Aphrodite, that survives only because a later grammarian quoted it to illustrate a point about poetic meter. The grammarian did not care about the poem. He cared about the meter. But because he quoted it, we have a few perfect lines. A woman's body trembling, her skin on fire, her sight failing, her throat closing. And then the fragment breaks off. The rest is lost. We will never know how the poem ended. We will never know what Sappho said after that moment of almost unbearable tension. And I find that loss more painful than the burning of entire libraries, because it is personal. It is a voice that was silenced in the middle of a sentence, and it has been waiting 2,500 years for someone to finish the thought. No one ever will. If you would like to travel again, we could visit another time, not the Greece of statues and philosophy, but the Greece of fragments and silences, the Greece that history forgot, and that only the imagination can recover. The light is different there. It is not the bright sun of the Mediterranean, but the softer, older light of a candle in a room where someone is reading alone, trying to hear a voice that has been speaking for 2 millennia, waiting for an answer.